The gray horror, too, belongs to that collection of feelings that have long been resting in our depths, ready to burst forth with an elemental force when the violent shocks occur. Rarely do its dark wings flap around the highbrow of the modern. To the primitive man, it was a constant, invisible companion on his wanderings through the immensity of the barren steppes. It appeared to him in the night, amid thunder and lightning, and with its strangling grip it brought our ancestor to their knees, the one who, only holding measly pebbles, managed to overthrow all the powers of the world. And yet this very moment of his greatest weakness lifted him above the beast. Because an animal may perhaps feel fear when a danger appears in front of it. It may feel fear when it is chased and cornered, but it does not know horror, for it is the first storm light of reason. Horror is closely related to lust, the intoxication of blood, and the pleasure of play. Didn't we all listen to eerie stories as children in the long winter evenings? Your entire being would quiver. You wanted to crawl into a safe cave, and yet you couldn't get enough. It was like getting lost in the reeds and mud, coming across a nest of spotted snakes and not being able to flee for the pleasure of looking at the hideous slithering. At places where the people seek thrills, at every fair, every rifle range, horror in lurid colors beckons on painted canvas. Pleasure killings, public executions, wax bodies covered with festering ulcers, long rows of anatomical atrocities. Whoever puts this on display knows the masses and fills the pocket. Often, and for a long time, I stood in front of such stalls and stared into the faces of those who came out. Almost always, there was a laugh, and yet it sounded so strangely embarrassed and forced. What was this laughter supposed to hide, and why was I standing there? Wasn't it because of my desire for horror? This lust is not foreign to anyone. This childish desire, this craving for horror, is well known to everyone, like the child wandering in the servant's kitchen, the peasant boy in the cabinet of horrors, young volunteers huddled around an older man in their barracks, whose voice still quivered with the horror of the battlefield. And even as their faces went pale and their eyes dark, there was not one who did not long for the day of marching out even more ardently. Every one of them was driven by the desire to stare into the face of Medusa, even if it meant that his heart would cease to beat. And the hour came for everyone when it brewed darkly, indeterminately from the depths, just when one thought of it the least, when the fields were as empty as on public holidays, yet there was something different about them, when the blood swirled in the brain and veins as before, a longed-for night of love, yet even hotter and madder, when one moved closer and closer to the thunderous noise in front, when the beats became more and more booming, more and more hasty, when the plains glowed before the overabundance of rushing thoughts, when one was so emotional that the landscape and the events only later escaped one's memory, yet darkly, as if it were a dream. The baptism of fire. The air was charged with such overflowing masculinity that every breath was intoxicating. One wanted to cry without knowing why. Oh, men's hearts can feel that. Then it swept along the column of men with a bat's wing, so that laughter and cheers died in the mouth. On the side of the street lay a woody, motionless body with a sharp, waxy face from which glassy eyes stare into the void. The first dead man, an unforgettable moment that froze the heart's blood into faltering ice crystals. Then the horror reared up in everyone as a pale, shy horse in front of the nightly abyss, and another impression forever bored itself into everyone's brain. His hand, like a claw beaten into moss and earth, the bluish lips over the whiteness of the teeth, the black, bloody crust in the hair. Oh, however much one might have prepared oneself, everything shattered at this gray figure at the wayside, on whose dirty face the first blue flies played. That vision, and the countless others to come, offered 1,000 different and distorted postures, torn bodies, and gaping skulls, pale, cautioning ghosts of insane trench soldiers, in the minutes before the storm, until the liberating cry rang out. Horror, as we understand it, is inextricably interwoven with death. We cannot separate it from it, just as primitive man could not separate it from the bolt of lightning that flashed to earth beside him. Will later generations also overcome this horror and think back to us in the same pitying emotion, to us and the feelings that trembled through our chest on the Odysseys, through the endless wasteland of the fronts? During those nocturnal walks in darting deserts, our hearts were so lonely and ravaged, as if it were swinging pendulously above the deadly shimmer of frozen seas. All warmth was swallowed up by the relentlessness lurking all around. Countless times the howl of a slowly dying man echoed into the void. Forward, only onward, toward the safe cave. Although one had walked over the trampled, scarred terrain for many years, one always jolted, as if recovering from a fit of madness, or waking up from terrible dreams. Where were we? Among the craters of the moon? Expelled into the depths of an inferno? This could not be an earthly landscape, this infernal dance floor of death, surrounded at the edges by yellowish flames. There were no hearths to spread a peaceful light in the room, only colorful signs of destruction flying through the air from some hole in the ground. Fireworks anticipating a roaring massacre. Not a shrub, not a blade of grass caressed the stumbling foot. Pale mists and poisonous gases flooded islands of sad trees, black shattered carcasses. Occasionally a house peeped out, abandoned and crumbling like a wreck at the bottom of the sea. What was it that groped for our hearts in the uncertain light from all angles with slimy tentacles? The horror of death and decay. The decay. Many men perished without cross or hilly burial in the rain, sun, and wind. Flies buzzed in thick clouds around his solitude, a damp mist hovering around him. The smell of a decaying man was unmistakable, intense, Swedish, and as revolting as mush. After great battles, it brooded so heavily over the fields that even the hungriest forgot to eat. Often a squadron of brazen fellows held on endlessly for days in the clouds of battle, stuck in an unknown piece of trench or a row of craters, like shipwrecked men in a hurricane clinging to shattered masts. Death had thrust his scythe into the ground, fields of corpses before them, mowed down by their bullets. Beside and between them the corpses of comrades, death itself in their eyes, which lay strangely fixed in sunken faces, these faces that recall the gruesome realism of old. Crucifixion images, almost languishing, they crouched in the decay that became unbearable when one of the iron storms stirred up the congealed dance of death again and hurled the destroyed bodies high into the air. What was the point of covering the new dead with sand and lime, or spreading sheets over them to escape the constant sight of those black, swollen faces? There were too many of them. The spade was always met with a buried body. All the mysteries of the trench lay in the sunlight, a hideousness before which the wildest nightmares paled. Hair fell in clumps from skulls like foliage from trees in autumn. The flesh of some corpses turned greenish, like that of fish, and glowed at night among the tattered uniforms. If stepped on, the boots left phosphorescent footprints. Others were dried into chalky, slowly decaying mummies, and others, the flesh would peel from the bones like reddish-brown jelly. On the sultriest nights, the bloated corpses would awaken like spirits, the gases escaping from their wounds, hissing and foaming. Most terrible of all, however, was the swarming that emerged from those consisting of nothing more than a mass of worms. Why should I spare your nerves? Didn't we ourselves once, for 4 whole days, lie in a trench surrounded by corpses? Weren't we all dead and alive, covered with a dense carpet of bluish-black flies? Could it get any worse? Yes, among the dead lay people with whom we had shared a few night watches, a few bottles of wine, and a few loaves of bread. Who, if not us, can really talk about the war? If, after days like these, the frontline soldier marched through the towns of the hinterland in gray, silent columns, stooped and ragged, the sight of him caused the carefree people to freeze. "He looks like he's just come out of a coffin," whispered one to his girlfriend, and anyone who was brushed. Dugout, descend the steps, shake the person lying on the cot, and wake yourself up. This sounds very ridiculous, I know. Anyway, that little episode lifted me up. We have torn something tangible out of the indeterminate. We have hunted down our horror in those men. Very seldom does the enemy appear to us as flesh and blood, although only a narrow, rumpled strip of field separates us from him. For weeks and months we crouch underground, overrun by swarms of bullets, surrounded by storms of steel. Sometimes we almost forget that we are fighting against people. The enemy expresses itself as the unfolding of a gigantic impersonal force, as fate, a blind destiny throwing random blows. When we come out of the trenches on the days of the storm and the empty, unknown landscape where death does its work amidst soaring columns of smoke stretching out before us, it seems as though we are entering into a new dimension. All of a sudden we see him very close, with his earth-colored coat and clayey face, a ghostly apparition waiting for us in the dead landscape, the enemy. This is a moment that one never forgets. How very different you thought it would be before. A forest fire, a flowering meadow, and rifles popping into the spring. Death as a shimmering back and forth between 2 rifle lines of 20-somethings. Dark blood splattered on blades of grass, bayonets in the morning light, trumpets and flags, a happy, sparkling dance. But here, people have long since forgotten to pay attention to the sound of guns. At night, people creep into gruesome deserts with adventurous weapons, and during the day they spend their time in the maze of shafts. This fight is not a fire, but a smoldering fire. Only now and then do you get the vague feeling that there are men on the other side too. That there too, the ringing of the bells of a sea sunk in Veneta at noon. Like the sinking of that high-spirited city, one felt the hopeless decay of a culture, shuddering at the realization of being swept away in the maelstrom. Between laughter and madness often lies nothing more than a knife's edge. Once, at the beginning of an offensive, I passed through a town where only the daily life of its inhabitants remained intact. A comrade elbowed me with a smile and pointed to a shop with a gaping roof and cracked walls. Strange but true, only one window had remained unbroken in the midst of the destruction. On it stood a whole row of women's hats. A few days earlier, while searching for a friend who had fallen after a battle, I had pulled apart the bodies of a group of corpses, and suddenly, from the torn jacket of one of them, a huge rat had jumped out at me. Nevertheless, this experience did not grip me as much as the ghostly contrast between the desolate street and the shiny tinsel of painted straw, silk, and colored feathers, which reminded me of women's hands and the thousand superfluities that make our lives colorful. Another time, during an endless night vigil in the dark corner of a trench, together with an old warrior, I asked him in a whisper to tell me a story, a true one, about his most ghastly experience. In short pauses, his cigarette glowed under his steel helmet, casting his gaunt face in a reddish aura. Here's what he told me. At the beginning of the war, We stormed a house that had been an inn. We forced our way into the barricaded cellar and fought in the dark, animated by an animalistic bitterness, while above us the building was already burning. Suddenly, probably triggered by the heat of the fire, a mechanical orchestration lit up and started playing. I'll never forget the carefree raucous of that. Dance music mixed with the screams of the soldiers and the gasps of the dying. There would still be much to tell about men who laughed long and hard after a bullet had crushed their skulls, about someone who tore off his uniform on a winter's night and raced across bloody battlefields grinning, about the satanic humor of the great field hospitals and many other things. But we children of the time have become tired of the bare facts, so tired. After all, it is not the facts, but precisely the uncertain, the indescribable, the dull foreboding that sometimes billows out like the smoke of a hidden ship fire. Perhaps it is all just a fantasy, and yet it was again so tangible, so leadenly heavy on the senses, when a forlorn troop voyaged under the dome of night through unknown terrain, far away and closer surrounded by iron heaves. Then suddenly in their midst a glowing ray tore itself from the earth. A cry of shattering realization drifted into the infinite. The brain could perhaps register the dark curtain of horror raised in the last fire, but what lay behind it, lurking, was not something our gaping mouth could describe any longer.